Hey, design enthusiasts! Welcome to Next in Line Design, a podcast by the World Design Organization's Young Designers Circle. We're all about embracing a new mindset in design, one that's bold, innovative, and impactful. We're here to connect with the next wave of design talent and explore how you can use your creativity to make a real impact. Get ready for fresh ideas and inspiration from young designers around the world who are reshaping the industry. We're here to spark conversations, inspire change, and explore new ideas in design. But remember, these are just our perspectives on one big, evolving field. Please note that the opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official views of the World Design Organization or its affiliates. Let's dive in and see what's next in line.
Hi everyone, welcome to Next in Line Design, a podcast created for and by young designers. My name is Palash and I am a young designer from India. I've studied industrial design, but currently I work as a design researcher where I lead design research and systems thinking initiatives in a research lab. What we basically do is try to bring life-centric and planet-centric approach to economic research and try to create evidence around how businesses can be the stakeholders, be the most influential stakeholders to bring the change that we all need. For the past year, I've been representing India as member of WDO's World Design Organization's Young Design Circle and also YDC as we call it. And we can get started with today's episode. So um, today on our podcast, we have someone truly special, someone who's walked a fascinating, winding path to design and impact, collecting some seriously cool experiences along the way. So meet Itika. She's a powerhouse of creative thinking, systems, wisdom, and also entrepreneurial spirit. She started her journey in the world of electrical engineering, then had a meaningful pit stop in liberal arts or social science with the Young India Fellowship, which is now run by Ashoka University, and then dove into design with National Institute of Design. Also, along the way, collecting some amazing experience with the most inspiring institutes, organizations like IDEO or Daily Dump. And I have been following Itika's work for a while now, but I got to know about her when she started Studio Carbon with her friends. So now, for those of you who have been in a design school, you have probably had that conversation with your friends where you must have said that, hey, let's do something together. Uh, Most of us move on. Life happens to us, but Studio Carbon actually did that. So a bunch of passionate friends came together and made this dream come real. And also not just a reality version of that dream, but also a studio that is radically creative, internationally active, and also when you go and check out their work, you'll see that their design is quite future forward, which kind of expands the very definition of design that we practice. So to start us off, I would like to know more about you, Itika. But instead of a linear recap of your journey, I'm more curious about where some of the experiences or the decisions that shaped the kind of designer you are today? And was there a moment or was there a phase where you decided, hey, this is the kind of designer or an innovator I want to become?
Thank you, Palash. I am extremely flattered, more than I should be from that introduction. Thank you for that. Okay, let's go back to where it all started. I didn't think that I would be able to find a profession or a vocation which could encapsulate the multitudes of interests that I'd already and always had. But it kind of, I think, all came together really, really well when I went to the Young India Fellowship. So we were in the first batch. So we were essentially guinea pigs that were being experimented on with everything, and that was the best
Mhm.
part of that year. And I went to the program because I wanted to explore a wide range of like subjects and points of view. And how do you look at the world? How do you make sense of the world from an anthropologist perspective, from a scientist perspective, from an artist perspective, from a humanitarian or a social scientist or a historian's perspective. And the idea was to go there because I think all my life I've always realized that there's something about this world that doesn't make sense when you see it fragmented.
Mhm.
I lived in the mountains. I'm born, brought up in the Himalayas. And I have lived and seen changes of the smallest decisions that you take of, the materials you decide to build your house with and how that determines 200 other things after, or the choices of what you grow or what you eat has so many repercussions. And I felt like there was something missing about understanding this connection, and it felt like the only way to do that is by learning about other points of view and other perspectives. And in the process of studying all of these amazing courses with some of the best faculty at YIF, I think one of the most cliched things happened to me. There's this really famous Buddhist saying, right, of when the student is ready, the teacher appears. I think that happened to me twice in life. So very, very grateful for that. It was during the Young India Fellowship that I was a part of the group that was designing the blueprint for Ashoka University, of what we would like the university to be and how we can scale up what we were able to do at the Young India Fellowship into a much larger format. And during that research, we were visiting different universities across India, and we'll end up going to NID and meeting this amazing professor who we lost a few years back, but I think his ideas have lived on through all of us, the students. He was a professor called MP Ranjan. For listeners, I'm sure a lot of people around the world would have heard his name. He was very, very vocal about his thinking, and a conversation with him suddenly made me realize that there was a framework and a terminology to how I would see the world and how I like to see the world and engage with it, which is called systems thinking and systems design. And there's a way I can now make sense of all of it. So I think that moment itself and that meeting with him at the Chai Gate, as we call in NID in Ahmedabad, where I think he saw some curiosity in my head, and then he just became like this informal mentor, giving me like thousands of GBs of books that he had and talking to me every few weeks. And then from there on and therefore, we sort of took it forward. But that I think was a moment of shift for me.
No, thanks a lot for that. I mean, definitely, the lived experiences you've had reflects in the kind of work that I've seen you do. I mean, I've been following your work for a while, but one thing that prominently stood out for me is the depth and the layer your work has, and not just you, your whole team, in all the ventures you've been part of. There's always that depth and layer, whether you're designing a single product or a service. And we'll get into details of how do you, train your mind in asking such questions, which helps you get into those depths. Yeah, that brings us straight to today's theme, which is systems thinking and how it relates to design. But before we get into discussing how do you use systems thinking in design, I want you to define what systems thinking might mean in practice. And that kind of reminds me of something that my father told me while I was a student. That is to have a productive discussion. It's quite important to share and agree on definitions, because if you don't define the definitions early on, you then end up um, arguing on them later. So how would you want to define systems thinking for those who are new to the concept, or for those who come from creative world?
Yeah. I'm very glad you brought that out of what your dad said, because I think that's the biggest challenge and opportunity of design and systems thinking. That as a practitioner around the world through generations, we've not been able to agree at those definitions. Every designer has their own relationship and interpretation of design, the same as with systems. On one hand, yes, you're right. I think when you don't describe it, it's very difficult to talk about it. But on the other hand, that also makes it so dynamic that there are infinite possibilities and you can
Mm.
always grow your definition based on what someone else is also sharing. So I'll talk about my understanding and definition and interpretation of systems design. We'll not call it the definition. Please challenge it if you feel otherwise.
Yep.
In my head, to very, very simply and succinctly put it, systems design is both a perspective as well as a tool. So it's a way in which you watch the world, but also a way in which you can engage and problem solve and build with the world. It's got the abilities of both. And what systems design is able to do is it's able to help you see, help you interact, and then also help you build with the complexities of the world that we sit in. So it helps you see how interconnected the smallest problem that you're trying to solve is with a million other things in the cosmos because of the sheer nature of life and living itself. It helps you visually see it and then visually be able to see how things are connected to one another. So, really understand when you do an X action, what possibly can happen to multiple other things in that system. And once you have understood it, it then helps you interact with it. So, you can actually decide what solution to make or which part of the system to solve a solution for without creating any unintended detrimental consequences of it. So, the simplest example, because you brought out Daily Dump, what we were doing at Daily Dump, which is a pioneer in India for home composting, when Poonam started Daily Dump, she wanted to solve the waste problem of our country. And that's like a very specific but a very big problem at the same time. So instead of trying to solve and be like, okay, let me start plastic recycling or whatever is the first thing that comes to her head, she said, okay, how is waste related to everything else in the country, right? How is it related to policy? How is it related to behavior? How is it related to industrialization and material consumption? How is it related to convenience? And the more she started engaging with it, with culture and diets and every choice that we as Indians make, she realized that in a bag of our waste in a household, 60% of it is actually just food waste because we cook most of our meals, unlike many other countries and cultures. And when 60% is food waste and it's very watery and, in a lot of abundance, that food waste, she realized, was creating a problem because the moment that food waste mixes with dry waste, which can be recycled, the dry waste is soiled. So you can't recycle it. Even though plastic looks like the biggest problem to solve, you can't access plastic if it's dirty. Similarly, with this food waste, when it interacts with toxic waste like your batteries or your diapers or your sanitary pads, it's again creating a lot of toxic mixture of liquids that will go back into the soil when the waste is dumped. And at the same time, because food waste is rich in microbes and there's always an activity going inside it, when you dump it on a landfill and keep piling it on top of each other, you're releasing a lot of methane. And the food waste is anaerobically composting in the absence of air. So instead of trying to say solve the whole problem of waste or jump to the first solution, she first understood the relationship of waste with all of these things, then started interacting with what can be solved and what should be solved, and then realized that this food waste, if that could stay in our houses and change our relationship with waste, everything else will happen like a domino, right? And that domino effect or that butterfly effect, as we call sometimes, can then become more intentional. So that's how I would describe systems thinking with an example, if that helps.
Oh, that's really true. And drawing from my little experience that I have in working around systems, I feel one crucial skill that a designer, not just a designer, I mean, now systems thinking, when we write a lot of grant proposals, and especially in the development sector, you see a lot of these grant proposals have this term systems thinking or design thinking being used. Most of these folks who are using these terms are not designers. So it's not something that's only for designers. But then one core skill that I have tried to develop is patience and ability to ask right questions. Uh, I want to know more about your journey of exploring systems thinking. Definitely, now you have a lot of experience, and all these things come naturally to you. All your design decisions are driven by all these experiences you have had so far, and it's quite easy for you to navigate through these complexities. But then, How did you start? How did you start with understanding the nature of how to understand complexities?
It starts with a very, very simple step, actually.
Mhm,
And that step is of just absolute and sheer curiosity. That's all.
mhm, mhm,
It's simply being curious about things. And I think that's what like the Young India Fellowship was, and that's what it drove me to sort of pursue. But it really just starts with very curiously trying to understand for the sake of understanding and nothing else. Right? It's essentially an attitude. It's not even a practice. It's an attitude that you can build in the way you look at the world. It's a very childlike property. It's where you don't give a label or a meaning or a definition to anything that you're looking at or smelling or engaging with or reading, but you really try to understand for the sake of understanding. And I think that's really where it all started for me in terms of starting to then make sense of it. I started my journey as an apprentice without being a designer, joining a design studio, and then saying, I learn along the way, just I'll do everything that I'm good at, and then I learn what I'm not. We landed up picking up a project on sanitation, and this is back in 2011-12.
mhm,
And what we now call the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan was called the Nirmal Bharat Abhiyan back in the day.
mhm,
And we were essentially trying to figure out ways of how do we uh, make India open defecation free? How do we make water and sanitation more accessible? How do we both change behaviors but also give access to resources to be able to make safer societies, healthier individuals, and all of that? And I think just engaging with something as complex as that and researching it on the go. So I was on the road through a program that we were running, which was the form of a carnival. So we were setting up a mela or a
mhm,
carnival in English, where it was a pop up carnival where we went through like 5 different states across India um, in a caravan of about 200 people between designers and engineers and sanitation workers and social workers and builders and everyone. And we would go to different villages along the way and then set up this mela, have a lot of like gamified experiences around awareness on sanitation to help them understand what happens when you open defecate, how do you have better menstrual hygiene practices, etc. Not be prescriptive, but actually just make it very experiential. And in that process started talking to individuals. Like I would go, we would spend a lot of time with different panchayats. I would go to different homes and just spend time with women, understanding their challenges, etc., etc. And I think just curiously sort of going out there and trying to understand what was really going on the ground became one of those big moments for me to start so almost practicing and understanding what systems thinking theories really mean. Because, like, for example, something as simple as religion was a very interesting take and had a very interesting connection to sanitation. So I was in one of these villages and we were having conversations in different households. And they had created a very wonderful public toilet system of like 10 toilets just outside of the village for people to actually use so they don't have to go open defecate in the farm. Interestingly, the only families that were using that space were Muslim families. And it had nothing to do with religion in itself, but just,
mhm,
ways of making sense of our lives that we have from different religious points of view. The Muslim families were doing that because for them, and in the Muslim families also, only the women were using it, not the men, which was
mhm,
again very strange. And the reason was because the whole idea of being very covered and not exposed as a woman in the culture was much easier for them to associate with going inside to a toilet.
mhm,
So the
mhm,
women would go there, both out of their own choice as well as, of course, men in the family recommending. But the men, on the other hand, didn't feel any such compulsion. So they didn't go ahead and do that. And on the other hand, the Hindu families that were living close by, for them, the sanctity of that village was like a sanctity of their home. And having a defecating place or a toilet within that sanctity didn't make any sense because the temple was still there, the gods were still there, and they can't coexist in the same space. So it almost felt sort of non anti-religion for them to go and use that toilet in the village. And something as simple as that, and a connection you normally would not make, suddenly became real because all I was doing was absorbing and not passing any judgments or my own biases of, say, either the life that I have or the religious beliefs that I have or any of those things. And then suddenly solving that problem became um, a very different leveraging point in the system to design for, rather than just building another toilet.
That's I mean, that's interesting. And one thing that I would maybe I can draw from that is all these experiences definitely humbles you as not just as a designer, but also as a
Yeah,
human being.
yeah.
But as a designer, then, or as a researcher, I would say, uh, how do you navigate through your own biases? Because definitely you might come from a different upbringing, uh, different intersectionality of your identities. How do
Mm.
you navigate those biases when you're just being curious?
The most essential step, and we practice this in the studio extensively, like this is almost a part of our ethos now, is to call out the biases. We
Hmm.
literally start every project, everything that I engage with, any designers that I work with, or even actually for that matter, non designers, any organizations we collaborate with, the first thing we list out are our assumptions.
Hmm.
Anything that we believe, but we can't prove if it's true or not, but we really believe it. Just putting that all out becomes a very, very key step in calling out these biases because I feel like awareness changes the game. And as
Hmm.
spiritual as that may sound, it's actually true.
Hmm.
So you put those assumptions out. If it helps, you go even one step further to writing a counter of that assumption, almost writing the opposite. Like,
Hmm.
I believe in the idea of God. I believe there is one power in the world that makes sense of everything that's going on. The opposite of that is going to be there is no one power in the world. And I can rewrite it. I can write there are multiple powers in the world that are making sense, or there is no power in the world. We are the power. And each of that suddenly now gives you another point of view,
Hmm.
right? So it could really start with something as simple as that. And the second thing, I'm so glad you used that word. It's very overwhelming. I
Hmm.
completely agree. But you know what? That feeling of overwhelming um, sort of emotions from just looking at the sheer complexity of it is also a very primal instinct, right? Because
Hmm.
as humans, we in our much earlier ages, we were primed to be able to predict because being able to predict right determined if we survived or not. If I could
Hmm.
predict where the animal is going to come from, the tiger is going to come from, I can survive or not. If I could predict where the next food will be available for me to hunt for, I could live better. But we're not the same humans anymore. We have a cognitive intellect that can make us question, right? So embracing the ambiguity and the complexity and just not being able to understand what the hell is going on for a really long time in your research is just something we have to learn to be comfortable with. I think also because in the world that we live in, um, we do a lot of sense making linearly. If this happens, then that will happen, and then I will do this. When I'm trying
Hmm.
to build a company, I already define my end goal that I'm trying to build this, and what is the shortest path for me to get to that goal, right? But the difference when you approach these things as a designer or a systems thinker is you know the direction, you know the vector that I want to fix the access of water to people. Like I want everyone in the world to have access to clean water. But I don't say that I'm going to build a tool to clean up the water that exists in the sewage or in the sea or because that's again going very specific. You don't even know if you have to clean up the water. Maybe there's a completely different way of harnessing water that we're not thinking of, right? So
Hmm.
that comfort of ambiguity of not defining an end goal, and then once you're in the middle of your research, not worrying too much about the fact that you don't have an answer but sitting with the problem. Again, sounds very spiritual but very literal, just sitting with that problem and trying to make it as visible as you can, making the connections as visible as you can, like putting it up on a wall like that, helps. So I would say those two things is what helps me, but can help all of us navigate this approach of thinking as well.
I can now connect. and segue into the activity that I planned for us, because the whole idea around that is just breaking down um, the system. Now we are used to calling it a system, but then earlier when I didn't understand the meaning of system, just breaking down what's in front of you. So
Yeah.
also for the listeners, there's a small activity. Maybe select a product around you. It could be a cup, a mobile phone, or a pen, and then ask yourself what systems had to come together for it to be that way. And Itika, what we can do is we can play along
Yeah.
with this activity. Let's take toothbrush as an example. Let's try to break down the existence of a toothbrush.
Yeah.
How would a mind map look like if you were doing this exercise? You can call it out, and I can type it out here.
Yeah, perfect. Let's look at it in every perspective, right? So we were saying
Mhm.
multiple paradigms of looking at a problem. Over here,
Yeah.
the first perspective is the perspective of materials
Hmm.
and material choices. So what materials is a toothbrush made of?
Hmm.
Whether it's made up of plastic, it has maybe some silicone in it, etc., etc., etc. The second perspective of breaking down a toothbrush could be, why does a toothbrush even exist? And when you
Hmm.
say, why does it exists for oral hygiene.
Hmm.
Why do you need oral hygiene? You need oral
Hmm.
hygiene because it is very critical for your physical health. Why do you
Hmm.
need physical health? Physical health is one of the most critical parameters by which we can live a fulfilling life. Why do you need a full, and you can go on and on and
Yeah.
on, right? So one is like paradigm. So paradigm of why do we need a toothbrush? What are the materials that it is made of?
Hmm.
Where history, where was the
Hmm.
toothbrush invented? Where did it all start? And the moment you go into history, you will realize again that historically the idea of oral hygiene was explored differently in different cultures. I'm so glad that you wrote that word down before I even said it. When you're looking at different cultures, let's use India as the easiest example. When I was little, I have literally broken sticks of a neem tree, a branch, a mini branch of a neem tree, and used that to scrub my teeth, right? And if the idea was oral hygiene, then you were doing two things. You were improving your breath, you were removing all the muck from your teeth and the gaps in your teeth. And at the same time, you were also trying to sanitize and remove any germs and bugs that were there, which is why neem is a great plant to do that with. And that exactly, it connects back to what we were exploring in the health paradigm of oral hygiene, right?
Hmm.
And similarly, when you see other cultures, you realize different reasons of why people used objects of oral hygiene the way they did. So suddenly, a toothbrush is not a toothbrush, but an object to clean your mouth or an object to remove bad breath. So now this becomes the paradigm of function. And
Hmm.
when you do function, then all of these are different functions of a toothbrush,
Hmm.
right? And then you go back from function into the form of a toothbrush, where you have like toothbrushes which are manual toothbrushes, and now suddenly you have these automatic toothbrushes, and now suddenly you have a mouthwash which is not even a brush but a liquid that you put in your mouth. Um, and the moment you start branching that out, you realize that each of that can be correlated to the material, can be correlated to the culture or history, or can be correlated to the function, or can be
Hmm.
correlated to the purpose of healthcare, for example,
Yeah.
right? And suddenly that humble little object that you use every single day, hopefully 2 times a day, has a whole other meaning and can be connected to the meaning of life itself.
Yeah.
Like the timing, which is okay, another one. So rituals. What
Hmm.
is how long should I brush for? Who determines
Hmm.
that? What happens if you don't brush? And then the healthcare system and the doctors and 200 other things sort of come into the picture. Then
Hmm.
aesthetics come into the picture. Why are teeth such a fundamental communicator of beauty? When
Hmm.
somebody changes their teeth, your way of looking at them completely changes. Completely.
Yeah.
Like I have these
Yeah.
cricket teeth. If I straighten them out, thanks to AI right now, you will absolutely refuse to recognize me with just my teeth, you know? So
Hmm.
communication now suddenly becomes an association with teeth and teeth with toothbrush, etc., etc. And I can go on and on and on. But all of this that we did was purely from curiosity, like I said
Yeah.
earlier as well, right?
Yeah.
And as you keep going in curiosity, and because you visually mapped it out on Miro, which I think was very, very smart, you can also start drawing the connections. And
Hmm.
now suddenly it becomes even more meaningful. So I would go one step even further. Right now, we identified the nodes and
Hmm.
started building connections with it.
Yeah.
If people have time and they can try this with absolutely any object, you can also start defining the connection. So, for example, the neem tree branch and the oral hygiene,
Hmm.
if you had to put a sentence to that connection, what
Hmm.
could that be? If you had to define it as an exchange of value, what is the exchange of value between a tree and our mouth?
Hmm.
Right? And you literally start defining the exchange of
Hmm.
value in every connection and
Hmm.
calling it
Hmm.
out. You go
Hmm.
even like a step
Yeah.
further in understanding
Yeah.
the system.
Yeah.
And then, if you are curious even further to experiment, you start changing the value.
Hmm.
What if oral hygiene could, like, what if the value was reverse from the neem tree to oral hygiene? It went from oral hygiene to the neem tree.
Hmm.
And suddenly we start talking about a business model where for oral hygiene, instead of making more toothbrushes, we
Hmm.
design a neem forest or we
Hmm.
design a park in every city in a distance of 10 kilometers where you
Hmm.
could just go every time you go for a run, you pluck a neem branch and then you
Hmm.
just like brush it, and then there's a place where you dump it where it then composts, and that compost is then put into the soil where you're growing your city's local vegetables, and then it goes on. So you
Hmm.
can start then flipping the value, and then
Hmm.
suddenly you
Hmm.
start really seeing the system, understanding
Hmm.
the system, and then interacting with the system.
Yeah, thanks a lot for laying that out. I mean, if I want to draw parallels of how the toothbrush industry has evolved, you'll see that between the same connection of neem branch and oral hygiene, someone understood the science behind neem and then introduced neem flavored toothpaste, and that connects to the perception of how you look at a toothpaste and
Yeah,
how do you want to connect it to Indian culture, and then that brings us to the whole marketing campaign that these companies have.
yeah.
Definitely, it's a tool. How you use it and what you use it for defines uh, your ability. I mean, let's say if you wanna decarbonize the toothbrush industry, this gives you an overview of I mean. Just replacing plastic with bamboo is not going to solve the
I will
problem.
go one step further on this entire piece. So, Palash, again, because we said we don't go assuming, decarbonization
Hmm.
is already a goal.
Hmm.
We're not defining
Hmm.
a goal, we're defining a vector.
Yeah.
Our
True.
vector is we want the toothbrush to become more sustainable or more contribute to like a
Hmm.
regenerative environment or
Hmm.
etc. Like there could be so many versions of a vector.
Hmm.
And the way to handle the vector, one of the ways is finding solutions for decarbonization. It could be something
Yeah.
completely different as well. So
Yeah. Yeah.
don't define the goal, define the vector, and I think you're already on the right path.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one step to that is not understanding how do we make the toothbrush sustainable, but how do we make oral hygiene sustainable? Then we
Perfect,
don't
even
need
better.
toothbrush.
Yeah, you change the problem.
Uh,
Exactly.
yeah.
You change the problem statement itself. Yeah.
All of this is fun. Definitely, all of this is interesting, and frankly, not many designers who are. See, the fact is that once you complete your education, you need a job, right?
Yeah.
And once you are in a position where you need a job, you enter a company where your managers or your uh, founders might not understand the importance of these interconnections because uh, we are trained to solve problems in isolation. So, as a young designer who's just starting out, how would you suggest me introducing this practice into my day-to-day work, uh, considering all the constraints around me. What I'm trying to say is, how would you articulate the fact around systems thinking complementing design thinking?
Hmm. Because we talked about definitions, personally for
Mhm,
me, they're not different. But that's a
mhm,
choice that I have made as a
mhm,
designer or what design means to me. But if you
mhm,
really have to break it down, right? So, say when the Industrial Revolution happened and when design, especially industrial design, the way we know it really blew up, the
mhm,
idea was that first we had these technologies and solutions, and
mhm,
then we realized that there isn't a layer over it because these technologies and solutions are used by humans.
mhm,
They need to be human centered. We need to
mhm,
understand people's needs, their motivations, their fears, their aspirations, etc. So we put this layer of what we now call design thinking of human centered approaches of building solutions rather than putting
mhm,
solutions in isolation itself. Um,
mhm,
has a very clear tangible value because there is a value of being able to sell more products, of being able to have more brand loyalty, of being able to etc., right? Now, if you go one level even above that, the if technology or solutions or innovations exist in the realm of humans using it, humans exist in the realm of a larger universe.
mhm,
We're not the only being on this planet, in this cosmos. We're not the only beings whose needs need to be met. Our
mhm,
life and choices and survival is very, very closely intertwined and dependent on everything else around us.
mhm,
So, from thinking only at human centered, we can take a level up and become system oriented in our choices.
mhm,
And what that sometimes means is, as a designer, when you're building a solution in a company, you can always just take a shot, like even an exercise like this, right? Half a day.
mhm,
Take a step
mhm,
back to have a macro perspective. Zoom in
mhm,
and zoom out. The zoom
mhm,
out, if nothing else, will create more awareness in you of the choices you're making in the zoom in. When I'm building
mhm,
that toothbrush, when I have these 200 perspectives of history, culture, materials, all of that we just discussed, then even the way I ideate on a toothbrush will change. I'm still making a toothbrush in the end for Philips, hypothetically speaking.
mhm, mhm,
But the ideation and the scope of what a toothbrush could mean now suddenly has grown. So it is still tangible. But the
mhm,
idea is to constantly give yourself the room to be able to zoom out.
mhm,
Very brief activity. It doesn't need something very extensive or fancy. It suddenly makes a small shift and do that at multiple stages. Do that at a research stage. Do that when you're actually ideating. Do that when you're prototyping. Keep taking a step out and step in. I think that becomes
mhm,
a very, very easy way to practice. The other thing which I always talk about is see, when you're trying to, there's no incentive for the world to be a better place or to change, honestly, right? Because the only incentive that works in our world right now is money, the
mhm,
exchange of value of money.
mhm,
And in
mhm,
that case, if you, as a designer who is led or intending towards creating more impact, and you know that to create impact, you really have to understand the system, pitching just that is never going to get you the job. Pitching just that is never going to get you an actual actionable product in the market that people can start using and changing their lives with, like with Daily Dump,
mhm,
where it was a composter, right? So
mhm,
in that case, the one thing that you can really, really start doing is hack your way into it. So I'll give you a
mhm,
very simple example. We were working with a company called Vattenfall, which is one of the
mhm,
biggest green energy producers in Western Europe. And they have some wonderful projects of solar energy, of wind energy, and they're taking a lot of pride in actually becoming net zero by 2040, right? They're really working towards it. Now, they hired us for a project where they wanted us as designers to reimagine and repurpose wind turbines because wind turbines have a life about 20 years and they wanted us to repurpose wind turbines. Now, as an industrial designer, because we had that portfolio, we went in and said, we can do that. I can come up
mhm,
with 200 things that you can make with a wind turbine that are profitable products that go into the market. That's almost like recycling plastic into another form. So we said, okay, we'll come in and we will do that. Got our foot in the door. And then when we started our research, we went all meta. We mapped out the entire ecosystem of energy itself around
mm,
almost 9,000 data points, qualitative and quantitative, and then started discovering opportunities and gaps in the entire system. So
mm,
we told them that, look, instead of us giving you ideas and solutions in week 2, we will give it to you in week 4. Let us research for the first 2 weeks and talk to you about it.
mm,
Right? And we mapped out the system. And after the first 2 weeks, we essentially presented insights to them. So, for example,
mm,
two very critical insights that we put out that they absolutely loved was, one insight was that the moment we started doing this research, we realized nobody in the wind industry actually knows of all the parts of a turbine. The producers of a turbine actually don't make a manual with all their parts and spec sheets because that's their IP. Because the industry is so competitive that even a few kilowatt extra efficiency of a turbine will make them a better producer. So a Siemens
mhm,
is not able to give all their technical drawings and specifications of a turbine to a Vattenfall, right?
mm,
And then when a Vattenfall is working and they have these maintenance crew who actually goes maintains the turbine, they have nothing to work with. They don't know what to maintain. So they actually go look at all parts of the turbine, make their own manual, and then use that manual to manage the turbine. And then when
mhm,
this turbine goes to the recycler after his life is done, the recycler also doesn't have the drawings because these drawings are the IP of Vattenfall. And
mm,
then they make their own version of etc etc, and then so much gets lost on the way, right? Just
mhm,
understanding the system to tell them, guys, we need to function like the aviation industry where all your IP is actually public. That's the only way you can actually run a successful business, instead of
mhm,
believing that you hold the information and you can run it more successfully. Because if Vattenfall passes these drawings on to the recycler, they'll have a much better market to sell that recycling parts to.
mhm,
The recycling will go to the right industry because the needs will be matched with the supply. And suddenly now the entire wind industry in the last 6 months has been having conversations, thanks to Vattenfall, about opening up the entire value chain and the IP of all the turbines and their drawings. And hopefully that will happen in the
mm,
next few months, right? But I
mm,
was still making the turbine parts for them while doing this, right?
mm,
There's another sort of insight, but I'll not go there. I think it'll go on for too long, but that's an example. So you can always start with a foot in the door, buy yourself a little bit of time, and tell them that there is credibility of outputs you will give in the end. And in the process, you will be able to show the value and then change the course of your design direction. So it's a
mhm,
little bit of it's a mix of creating and selling, which I
mhm.
think we do really well as designers. So convincing is one of our biggest powers.
No, I want to get into details of that, but before that, I want to also talk about. See, I come from industrial design background, and let's say I am designing a mixer grinder, and when I am in the process of designing the mixer grinder, the North Star
Yeah,
for me is that the coconut should turn out to be a nice chutney, right? Uh, that's how we evaluate the impact.
yeah,
How do you build the patience and also understand the tools to, uh, if not evaluate, but then very well articulate the potential impact of such projects? Because
yeah,
definitely there is a lot of research and evidence that complements it, but
yeah.
then to the fiction that you're trying to create, how do you how do you measure the impact as designer, or at least create the appetite to understand how to do that?
A very, very valid question. And I'm very glad that you brought that out. Because this exact question has led me to now working on my next venture, Studio WIP, or work in progress. Because I realized very quickly that every time we're making choices as innovators and designers of making this world a better place, A, we don't know what better means. We don't stop to ask that question. Second, we don't know how to measure that impact, or if what we're doing is
Mhm,
right or not, if the indicators are right or not, right? And there's a huge gap in being able to identify what the real change that's happening on the ground is, and is it desirable or not. Um,
mhm,
the fun thing to realize over here is we design by nature and systems thinking by nature is abductive and it's thinking. And what that means is, unlike inductive or reductive thinking, which is what we use in science, where we say there's an XYZ amount of observations, and then I deduce from there that this is a theory and that theory is universal. or that I have a theory and then I try and put and see what all objects it actually applies on. Design is not like that, right? It's constantly iterating. So when you are making any of these decisions, when you're designing this coconut, uh, sort of the chutney maker, you know one of your goals is to make sure that the coconut is yummy. When you study the user experience, you realize there are additional goals. What do I do with the coconut shell after that? Because I'm going to collect them every single day. How do I break the coconut apart when I bring it from the outside? Which means, am I bringing it raw, like already cut out from a shop, or am I bringing it from a farm directly, etc.? And then suddenly the ecosystem starts coming to the picture, right? So you define one boundary of, so
Mhm.
your boundary could be time, like you have to design this in 2 weeks. Your boundary could be money, it has to be under an X amount of value. You can define it in usage, it's only for these kind of users or this kind of a household. You define a boundary, you start doing the macro micro search in that boundary, come up with a solution, put that solution out, study it, come back, change it, put it out, study it again. It needs iteration is not just a buzzword. It literally is something that you can practice from the get go in your practice of design. And what I mean
Mm.
by that is there are multiple projects. So, Dungse, for example, the cow dung materials that we have built out was like that. The first set of materials we built out were in 3 months with no background in material innovation. Purely through
Mm.
curiosity and iterative thinking, we were able to come up with 16 recipes that we made in 3 months and displayed it at the Dutch Design Week. Took
Mhm.
people's reactions, started understanding the ecosystem, started talking to more farmers because now they had something to talk to us about, started talking to
Mhm.
researchers in universities, went back, did more research, came up, refined these 16 into 8 materials, came
Mhm.
back, made a few products with it, sold it to a few companies at cost. We were able to cover up our own costs in that process. Learned from how the usage was it breaking down, was it not, etc. Came back, refined it, and now we have amazing materials that we can now scale.
Mm.
Right? So you can always take that step in and out by defining the boundary, but remember that you are an abductive thinker. You don't have to
Mm.
define the end goal and or
Mhm.
define a theory and then test it, because you know that theory,
Mm.
and we embrace that. We embrace the living nature of systems and then design for that and let it evolve as the system evolves.
No, I mean, thanks a lot for bringing that up because with my little experience of working in the intersectionality of design, research, and systems thinking, one thing that I've realized as a design student, we are trained to solve problems. But I've realized that solving problem is part of the process, but the process cannot begin with the mindset of solving problems. And if your process starts with a mindset that I want to solve for that, I think you need more humbling. And that's such a great note to kind of end the conversation. Frankly, I really want to go on with this conversation because systems is something that you can keep talking about.
Yeah.
Definitely doing it in practice is very different. But also, I totally agree with you that systems isn't just a method, it's a way of seeing. And the more we train ourselves to see the connections and the complexities, the more informed and impactful our decisions can be as
Yeah.
designers.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Itika, for agreeing to be on this podcast
Not at
where we
all.
are trying to guide the young designers who will be shaping all the systems in the future. Thanks a
Amen to
lot.
that.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Palash. I had a wonderful time. It's always good for me to remind myself the values that I also care about. And this is a great way to do that. Thank you for that.
Next in Line Design is a podcast for designers by young designers. We hope that you really enjoyed today's episode. We've got some really exciting conversations coming up that we can't wait to share with you. Every episode, you're going to have the chance to meet a new member of the YDC. So enjoy our rotating cast of designers and feel free to reach out in the comments just to say hey, maybe to share some feedback, your story, or tell us more about the kind of conversations that you'd like to be hearing. In the meantime, make sure to subscribe to the WDO's channels and hit that notification bell so that you never miss an episode. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you back here soon with more of Next in Line Design.